Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon.
I believe, sirs, that the hour has come. My judgment approves this measure, and my whole heart is in it. All that I have, all that I am, and all that I hope in this life, I am now ready to stake upon it. While I live, let me have a country, a free country.
My guest today is professor and award-winning author, Dr. Woody Holton. He is the McCausland Professor of History at the University of South Carolina, where he teaches early American history and the American Revolution with a special focus on African Americans, Native Americans, and women. He is the author of award-winning books, including Forced Founders, Indians, Debtors, Slaves, and the Making of the American Revolution in Virginia, and Unruly Americans and the Origins of the Constitution. Holton's 2009 book, Abigail Adams, which he wrote on a Guggenheim Fellowship, won the Bancroft Prize. His most recent work is Liberty is Sweet, an integrated history of the American Revolution, and that will be our topic of discussion today. Of the book, Publishers Weekly says, this richly detailed, multi-dimensional history casts America's founding in a revealing new light. And we are very pleased to have the distinguished professor and award-winning writer with us today. Welcome, Dr. Holton.
Thank you very much.
I'd like to start with some of the maps that you actually have in the book. First, the map of the native nations at the beginning of your book. Could you describe how it's different than other maps that are in history books? And then later on in your book, you have basically a map of what would be considered the frontier at that time. So how do those maps kind of set the tone for your book, Liberty is Sweet?
I really appreciate your asking, because I put a ton of work into them, because most of the textbook maps that I grew up with, and a lot of them still out there now, well, they either have no Native Americans at all, as though it was empty land, and so they're reinforcing one of the myths that the settlers propagated, or if they have Indians at all, they kind of have the word Cherokee out there somewhere, and north of that or somewhere, or the Illinois Indians and the Iroquois, or where they are, but it's just words without lines. And it reinforces a notion that Native Americans were just wandering around hunting and gathering like cavemen or whatever. But the reality is that they did have borders. Now, they fought over their borders just like Europeans and Africans did, but they had borders. They also had towns. And so my book was not unique in portraying Native Americans, but I think it's the first to do Eastern North America and at least name some of their towns, along, of course, with a lot of the European towns as well. So for me, it's a great beginning to get everybody on the map.
Woody, it is tradition here to accompany the conversation with a special brew. Today, we have Sweet Liberty Imperial Stout from the brewery of Placentia, California. You can quench the unquenchable thirst for decadent treats with this pina colada-inspired beer. Rich, full-bodied, and brewed to taste, this Imperial Stout was treated with a tropical twist of pineapple and coconut, proving that liberty is indeed very sweet. Remember, the best way to enjoy an episode is with one of our featured brews. This is also my time to ask you to subscribe to the podcast. Just hit that subscribe button and get the newest releases immediately. I would also like to thank the growing legion of listeners from thousands of cities and towns in more than 80 countries. And today, I'd like to give a special shout out to our listeners in Richmond, Virginia. And now, I raise my Sweet Liberty Imperial Stout very high. And to all the founding fathers and mothers from every part of colonial society, I say cheers. The lax trade and political policies the British government had towards the North American colonies, known as salutary neglect, kind of comes to a close in that mid-1700s, 1760s. Why was it at that time that the lax enforcement of regulations came to an end?
Because, as a friend of mine pointed out to me years ago, because they won. That is, the British in 1763 defeated the French. They drove the Spanish west of the Mississippi River, so that's going to be Spanish territory. But the French are almost entirely gone from North America. They have two tiny little islands out there off of Newfoundland. But because they won, they can now, the British government can now afford to do things to its colonists that it couldn't afford to do before, because they're the ones on the ground. And if the British are going to defeat the French and the Spanish and the Indians and others, they need the colonists' full support. But they didn't need that support after 1763. And so, we can liken this to a lot of marriages that you and I have both witnessed, that resentments build up and they build up and then build up and then they finally explode. Well, now that I mention it, do you remember that time back in 1993 when you embarrassed me at a park? All this stuff comes flooding out, and it turns out that there was a tremendous amount of pent-up grievances, not by the colonists against the crown, but by the crown against the colonists. And one of the clearest was molasses smuggling. Way back in 1733, the British had said, you got to buy all of your molasses from British sugar islands. That you raise sugar cane, you turn that into molasses, but the real money is buying molasses and converting it, distilling it into rum. And so the British government had said to the colonists for decades, great, you guys want to make rum, go for it, but you got to buy your molasses from British slave plantations in the Caribbean, places like Jamaica and Barbados. And the colonists had basically said back to Parliament, the hell with that. We can buy molasses a lot cheaper, and there's just more of it in French islands like Saint-Domingue, which became Haiti, and Spanish islands like Cuba and Puerto Rico. And so the colonists bought their molasses from the bad guys, from the enemy, even when they're at war. And so that's one of the many things that the British government was mad at the colonists about. Well, provoking wars against Indians was another. It's kind of like my little brother goes and gets a fight started, picks a fight against somebody, and then I got to go deal with the big kid that he picked a fight with. And then as now the most expensive thing that governments did was go to war. So the colonists would pick a war with the Indians, and then the redcoats would have to come to resolve it. And, they always eventually won because they were so powerful, but it's expensive. And so the colonists were doing all these things that made the British government mad, but the British government didn't feel like it could crack down on them until February 1763. That's really the pivotal date, because that's when the French basically surrender and leave North America, and that frees the hands of the British government to crack down on its colonists. So my first section of my book is called The King's Grievances, not the colonist grievances, because he's the one that had grievances. They were pretty happy. It was the king and Parliament who really had the power, who were the ones that wanted to make changes.
And of course, you're referencing the French and Indian War, which of course is part of a larger global conflict. What lessons do the Americans learn from that war? And then what lessons do the British learn? And then I'd like to know specifically, do they gain a better understanding of the Native American nations that are out there because of the conflict?
Yes. To answer that last question, they gained a very hard-won lesson throughout the war. But I start the book with what I think is the emblematic scene of that war, July 9th, 1755, when George Washington joined, along with 6 other guys who would later become generals in the Continental Army, joined as British subjects very enthusiastically in the British government sending an army out to capture the area that's now Pittsburgh. It's the beginning of the Ohio River in western Pennsylvania, to capture it from the French. And that army was just about wiped out. 2/3 of them were casualties, but not so much to the French. The French were there, but it was really their Indian allies who wiped them out. And so I called my preface invisible enemies, because that's really what the Indians were. And George Washington was one of the survivors of that battle. He learned that lesson, that sometimes your most lethal enemies are the ones you can't see. And I think for me, that's sort of a message throughout my book, that there's a lot of players in this game that are invisible players, but that doesn't make them any less important. So that's a lesson for the colonists. But I want to stress that the ones who really learned a lesson from the French and Indian War were the British. And that lesson was, these colonists are getting a free ride. They're not helping to pay for the wars, or at least they're not paying nearly as much as we are. And they're provoking the wars, as I mentioned. They're trading with the enemy during the war. So the French and Indian War was a period of growing British resentment of the colonists, with nothing to do about it. And then it's like a balloon inflating, and then pop on February 10, 1763, because then they can do something about it. And they did. The Parliament cracked down on the colonists in all of those areas that I mentioned. They tried to crack down on molasses smuggling and taking land from Indians. Most famously, the Parliament started the next year, 1764, to tax the colonists. And we had the next year after that, in 1765, we get the famous Stamp Act. It's really the British who started the American Revolution, and they did it for the reasons that we've been talking about.
And you bring up the end of the war and the proclamation line of 1763. It's not actually the line itself, because the British had all kinds of regulations that were basically ignored. It's the enforcement of it that's the problem, and the length of it, and the amount of soldiers that's required to enforce it. And not only that, so for the colonists, obviously they don't like all of the soldiers that are there, doesn't sit well with them, but for the British, it's very costly, and you just mentioned that. So the enforcement of that really had to ratchet up the tensions between the two.
Well, and the enforcement was uneven too, because it's a line on a map. It's not like the Great Wall of China. And so actual settlers could just go west of the line and, set up their little house on the prairie. But if you are a land speculator and you don't really want to move out to the west, but you're George Washington or Thomas Jefferson or Ben Franklin, all big land speculators, they want pieces of paper saying that they have ownership of these 30,000 acres of land, and then they cut it up into parcels of maybe 400 acres each and sell them all. They can't do any of that any more than you, Rob, can sell your car unless you can find the title and sign it over to the person that you're selling your car to. They couldn't get title to the land. They couldn't make money off of it. And that's one of the most interesting things about the revolution to me, is how the relationship between one group and another group is influenced by a third or fourth group. So in this case, the relationship between the colonies and the crown is affected by the fact that the colonies are actually divided into actual settlers who can go settle in the West and speculators who can't, and who are mad about that. And so they're mad at the crown. But then why did the crown say you can't settle in the West? Because of Indians. So resisting encroachment on their land and putting the British to the expense of these big wars like Pontiac's Rebellion. And so what started off looking like a two-party battle between the colonies and the British government is really, in that case, a four-party battle, because the colonists are divided among themselves, and the Native Americans are really playing the crucial role in this and getting the whole thing going.
I know there were New York City slave revolts and problems, and the Stono Rebellion was in 1739. In that time period, though, in the Revolutionary period, how intense was the fear of a slave revolt or rebellion?
Well, I might liken it to the fear that people have of plane crashes. Planes don't crash very often, knock on wood. But I am knocking on wood because there is still this fear of it, even if it's not a common thing, because when it does happen, of course, it's so horrific. And for whites, of course, the terror of a slave revolt was greater than you would think from the number of revolts that we know about. And in fact, it's probably true that whites inflated the number of conspiracies. There was one in my home state of Virginia in 1800 where no whites were killed. So it's possible the whole thing was a figment of whites' kind of fevered imaginations. Likewise, Denmark Vase's revolt here in 1822, the most recent scholarship on that says there was no Denmark Vase revolt. Whites just got themselves into a tizzy about it. On the other hand, there's probably conspiracies that were canceled at the last minute, but the whites never knew about. But it's the not knowing. Now, slavery is war. It is a constant war against the enslaved, but they do sometimes fight back. And it's not always a revolt where you've got 50 or 100 people like in the Stono Rebellion. It's more often, we think that James Madison's grandfather was probably poisoned and murdered by a slave. And these one little incidents here and there, not many people knew somebody who had been murdered by a slave, but if you're white, you knew somebody who knew somebody. I remember asking that question about my students right after 9/11. Does anybody know anybody who died up there in New York or in Pennsylvania? And none of them did. All right, how many know somebody who did? And everybody almost did. And it was like that. It was a fear, but the biggest fear related to slave revolts, and you saw this during the French and Indian War, was an alliance between our slaves and our external enemies, whether it's the French or the Spanish. And then, of course, in the Revolutionary War, it's going to be the British forming an alliance with enslaved people against the colonists. 1 in 5 people in North America were enslaved. And so for them, every day is war. And you're just like we always say in World War II, the prisoner's duty is to escape. And they are looking for all kinds of forms of resistance, but one of them is to escape. And then that's one of the things that happens in the Revolutionary War. Some of the British governors and generals, especially in the South, where 90% of enslaved people lived, some of these British governors and generals were just desperate because they had so few whites who wanted to fight for their king, because most whites were furious at Parliament for all the things we've been talking about. So if you're, say, Governor Dunmore, who was the last royal governor of Virginia at the time was the largest colony by far. And if you're Governor Dunmore, you've got very few white loyalists, and you can tell that you're going to at some point be fighting the white Patriots. He threatened as early as April of 1775 to issue basically an Emancipation Proclamation, not too different from the one your friend Abraham Lincoln would issue 77 years later. He threatened it in April. Some slaves came to him and said, "Okay, man, put us to work. We're ready to fight. We just want our freedom as a reward." He turned them away, but they kept coming. And finally, in November of 1775, Governor Dunmore did issue that Emancipation Proclamation. And we can follow that thread in a bunch of different directions. It's fascinating to hear what African Americans did fighting for freedom on the British side. You had about 8,000 who did that, roughly the same number fighting on the American side. Generally, this is an overgeneralization, but generally in the North, if you were Black and you participated in the Revolutionary War, you fought on the American side. So there were Black heroes of Lexington and Concord, Battle of Bunker Hill, the highest ranking British officer killed there was killed by an African-American guy. So in general, African Americans who fought in the Revolution on the American side, that was in the North, but in the South, they mostly fought on the British side. And so another way we could follow that thread of Black participation in the Revolutionary War was look at this from the perspective of whites. 60% of Virginians were white, 40% were Black. South Carolina was about 50% Black, 50% white. And here is the governor of your colony who's supposed to be protecting you from slaves. That's sort of his number one job. He's now doing the opposite of that. He's organizing your slaves to attack you. As one Virginian put it, aiming a dagger at our throats through the hands of our slaves. And I actually collected on Twitter. I'll put in a little promo here, Rob. It's called Countdown to 1619 because it was related to, it was the most controversial argument made in that New York Times Magazine Now book, the project called the 1619 Project. There was a claim there that a lot of people disputed, but I thought was exactly right. They didn't say it right in the magazine. They fixed it for the book. But here's the claim, that one thing that made many white people angry against the British was this alliance that the British made with enslaved people. And I put alliance kind of in quotation marks because it's not like they signed a treaty, but it was an informal alliance. And also, really, I should correct myself. I said the British made an alliance with the slaves. It was really the slaves who initiated this alliance with the British. But my point is, whites blamed the British for that, and it just infuriated them. It would be basically like if I found out that President Biden had sent my son a pistol to shoot me with. I would be so mad. Hopefully my son wouldn't shoot me, but he's my son, not my slave. So yeah, as a teenager. Anyway, you see the point that whites were furious. And I'm in the group that I've seen the quotes from Thomas Paine and Jefferson and Washington and Benjamin Franklin, all the others saying, we are furious about this. And then Paine said, we'd be fools not to drive these people, that is the British, from the continent. And so that's one of the reasons. Oh, there's so many other reasons, but one of the reasons the colonists took that final fateful step of declaring independence was their anger at the British for allying with their slaves.
One of the things that's often overlooked, and you mention it in Liberty is Sweet, is the advantage that the British had because of their, I guess, partial immunity to some diseases. And of course, Washington has this intense fear of these diseases, not just smallpox, but others. And of course, his stepson will eventually succumb to one of these camp fevers. So what's the nature and the impact of disease on the American Revolution?
Well, I'm mostly just going to quote here on smallpox, a wonderful book called Pax Americana, spelled pox not in the Latin way, but in the modern English way, P-O-X, because Elizabeth Finn, who wrote that book, makes a very persuasive case that the Americans, there was a point where they were in real danger of losing the war, not so much to the British, but to smallpox. And that's because they were more vulnerable to smallpox than the British for two reasons. One, you could get inoculated against it. There were methods that had been developed, actually brought to America by an African who had seen it practiced back home, similar to our modern inoculation or modern vaccination, only the inoculation, as they called it, it could kill you, but the chances of it killing you were a tenth as big from the inoculation method as from getting it naturally just by getting near somebody with smallpox. Anyway, the point is that many more British soldiers had been inoculated. And also, they're just coming here from a much more densely populated country. And so it's like, if you live in Quincy and I live in Chicago, I'm going to get disease before you do because I'm packed on an L train all the time, and I'm getting exposed to people. London was one of the most dense concentrations of people in the world, and so it's almost true to say that in Britain, by the time you were about 21, you had either died of smallpox or gotten it and survived it, and with that acquired lifetime immunity. But the Americans didn't have that, and so they were dying in droves of smallpox early in the war. And the doctors came to Washington and said, you got to inoculate the troops. And at first, Washington said no, because while they're being inoculated, they're going to be vulnerable and the British can overrun us. And he resisted it, but the men kept dying. And it's one of the things I really admire about George Washington that most people don't know about him. And that was, he was a guy who could change his mind.
Yeah.
And he changed his mind about inoculation, inoculated the troops. And Professor Finn totally persuades me that he thereby saved his army.
You know, you bring that up about Washington, and it's absolutely true. I think in modern politics, we have this idea that if you do change your mind, it's a weakness. We don't generally consider Washington as having leadership weaknesses in that regard. So it's absolutely true. It's a lesson that can be learned. Often in Revolutionary War interpretation, the women are brought up in these just individual figures like Abigail Adams or Margaret Corbin. She helped her husband fight and then took up arms at the cannon and so forth. And that's really what you get about female participation in the Revolution. But it's far deeper than that, as your book points out. Countless women were involved in the war. Would you speak on two areas, though? What impact or contribution women had in enforcing or making sure that those boycotts had teeth, and then also in spying and espionage?
Right, great. Well, first, in the pre-war era, and it's important to remember that the war lasted for 8 years, from 1775 to 1783. But before that, we have 13 years of, I won't say nonviolent conflict because there was tarring and featherings and there was the Boston Massacre, but the struggle went on for 13 years before it became an out-and-out war. And the most effective weapon that the colonists had was not dumping tea in Boston Harbor or tarring and feathering customs agents who were trying to enforce the molasses ban. It was boycotting British merchandise. And they did it 3 times against the Stamp Act in 65 and against the tea tax and other taxes called the Townshend duties in 1767 and 9, and then really on a heavy scale in 1774. And, probably most of the people listening have participated in a boycott. We boycotted Japan back in the 70s because of whaling and things like that. A lot of people boycotted Exxon after the Valdez spill up in Alaska. I think that was in the 90s. People understand boycotts, and they understood them. And even though the word didn't exist in the 18th century, they understood the concept. And it was a way to really pressure the British. But men who saw themselves as the only ones who can legitimately involved in politics realized they couldn't pull off a boycott unless women helped them, because women were half the consumers, probably a slight majority of the consumers of tea. And women not only do you need to get women to swear off these things, but you also need to get women to, if you're going to boycott essential things like clothing, well, if you're not going to run around naked, you're going to need women to substitute that clothing by making their own.
Sure.
And so you do get women signing their own boycotts against British tea. I will tell you, one of the fun things I found for the book was in Boston, the men had just adopted a big tea boycott saying, no exceptions. And then a week later, the women adopted their boycott of tea and they said, except for medical reasons. In this era when there weren't that many doctors and the doctors they had weren't very good, your real doctor was Dr. Mom. And Dr. Mom believed that tea, you and I still think it can be kind of soothing and helpful when you're sick. And so even within this consensus among men and women that we got to boycott tea, there's a little bit of a conflict where women made a medical exception, kind of like, we have these conflict now of, okay, ban marijuana, but have a medical exception. That's one of the things that was fun for me, was to see the conflict within our side. And that happens when you put men and women on the same timeline. A lot of books about the revolution have a chapter on women in the back or something. But when you put them in the same timeline as men, you see things like, wait a minute, these women made their exception to tea a week after men said no exception. So they boycotted tea. They had what they called spinning bees, or more commonly spinning matches. And a match, like a tennis match, this is women competing, especially young women, to see who can spin the most yarn in a day. But they're doing it for patriotic purposes. And I think the reason they really came together as groups to do it was that by the time of the American Revolution, spinning was kind of seen as a low-class thing to do. Or it's something you did if you were literally a spinster. That is, a woman who'd never married. You go live with your sister and you help pay for your upkeep by spinning thread. So, or maybe rednecks out of the frontier, though they can have their spinning wheels. But I'm a sophisticated Philadelphia lady. I'm too good to work a spinning wheel. So if you do it as a group and you do it for this patriotic purpose, then it's easier for women to do. But I'll tell you this, in the South, the association between spinning and slavery was so great that other historians and I have scoured the records, and we've never found a single example of a spinning bee in the South.
Wow.
White women just couldn't bring themselves to do that.
How about in regards to the espionage? They often say that Washington didn't defeat the British on the battlefield. He just outspied them. How integral was women's role in that?
Women certainly did do that. But actually, before I answer your question about the exciting thing of espionage, let me talk about the mundane things that women did, because they were really crucial too. We already talked about smallpox, but let me tell you about all the lives that women saved in the Revolutionary War by washing shirts. That is, most of the laundry was done not by the men themselves, but by laundresses. And you think, you couldn't have a lower job in the army than just whacking shirts against rocks or stirring them around in boiling water. But when you stir a shirt around in boiling water, you kill the lice on it. And when you kill lice, you save men from getting typhus. And typhus was the number one killer in the Continental Army after Washington got smallpox under control. And so, bullets, they're way down the list beyond the fevers that you mentioned and the typhus and the smallpox. And so women are really playing that kind of crucial role. And in fact, I have a student from just across the river. You're based in Quincy, right across the river from you is Missouri. And I have a student from Missouri, and she discovered that there were several occasions on which laundresses were really getting ripped off. They weren't being paid or they weren't given full rations. So they went on strike. And they knew they could get something by going on strike because they were so essential to the army. So that's much more mundane than women spying, but it was crucial. And yes, there were women spies. That really gets played up in that TV series Turn, but there's truth behind that, including the woman, I think her name was Fanny Wright. Fanny Wright over in Britain, who was one of many British people who was sympathetic to the American side. You may not be quite old enough to remember, as I am, Rob, Jane Fonda, who was sympathetic to the North Vietnamese side in the Vietnam War, which really seemed like treason to a lot of people. There were people like that in Britain who were very sympathetic to our side, including this woman who was originally from here, Fanny Wright. She was a wax sculptor, and she did do stuff for the American side. She wasn't murdered by British spies the way the TV show indicates, but there were women who did spying. You gave me too great a temptation to mention the image on the cover of my book, which I'll describe. It looks like there's a British courier who's being captured, or a couple of British couriers who's being captured by an American infantryman, and he's taking their mail pouch away from them. He's going to go deliver it to Nathaniel Greene, who was the American commander in the South. And this is a true event that happened not too far from where I'm talking to you. I'm in South Carolina. And so this incident actually happened in 1780, but the guy capturing the British couriers is not a guy. It's a woman dressed in men's clothing. There are actually two of them, only one in the picture here. And they were both named Martin because they'd married two brothers of that name. They found out about this message and they disguised themselves as men to capture it. And instead of going to a British general, it went to the American general, Nathaniel Greene. And so there's that. There are incidents like that. There are women who served as Paula Revere's. Paul Revere was important, but he was part of a whole network of guys who were riding all over Massachusetts, getting the word out that the regulars were out. They didn't say the British were coming, but the regulars were coming west.
Right.
He was part of a network, but there were several cases where women rode by themselves out ahead of a troop of British cavalry to let the Americans know that they were coming and trying to trap them so the Americans could turn the tables and trap the British.
You brought up, and I'm glad you did, some of those mundane duties. I know there's cases where Washington's wanting to move his army and he can't because there are women that are pregnant and giving birth. And I know it's really frustrating for him. And you look back at it and you said, why did he put up with that? Well, the reason for that is because they were absolutely essential. He needed the women there in the camp. He knew that cleanliness was important to the army to kind of tamp down not just that disease, but just problems that the army would generally have. So it's essential to the army during that time. Cleanliness, I've spent 28 years in the army. Cleanliness is still really important, and Washington understood that too. And if they didn't have those women in the camp, that wasn't going to be possible.
Well, you'll be able to tell me from your Army service, I think this is correct because I don't go much into the 20th century in my scholarship, but I think World War II is the first American war where more of our guys were killed by bullets and bombs than by disease. In the Revolutionary War, the number of guys shot in the battle, and of course, I don't want to diminish this because it's only 7,000. That's 1% of the number of Americans who died in the Civil War. That's fewer than died in 3 days at Gettysburg were shot. But 35,000 men died in the Revolutionary War when you add in disease. As far as I can tell, not one American died at Valley Forge of cold or hunger, the two things we think about. Now, they were cold as hell,
right?
And they were hungry as hell. And frankly, the cold and the bad nutrition, not malnutrition, but poor nutrition probably exacerbated their susceptibility to disease. But those 2,000 guys died of disease. So people understand that disease is important, but they don't understand how important it is. At the time, people were very aware of it, especially tropical diseases. And on both sides, the British side as well as the American side, men really resisted heading south. It's one reason that Washington was so obsessed with attacking the British in New York City was that he was afraid he couldn't get his men to march to Virginia. He'd lived all his life there and could handle the disease, but his army was made up mostly of New Englanders and guys from the middle colonies, and they did not want to go south. And when he finally did march from south, mostly because the French talked him into it, to Yorktown and victory, on his way south, the men got something they had never gotten before, which is a month's pay in real money, not IOUs, but actual gold and silver, which he'd borrowed from the French, and the French had borrowed it from the ladies of Cuba. It's a wonderful story. But he did that partly, he's a nice guy, but also because he knew he was facing possible mutiny over the issue of tropical disease. As Lafayette had marched a smaller army, only 1,000 guys, south earlier in 1781, and had mutiny, desertion, the whole business. And, carrots and sticks, he hanged a couple of them, but he got the women of Baltimore to make them all shirts, anything to make them feel better about having to head south.
Well, the war is tough business, as you have already mentioned, and it becomes protracted. Why do men with power, though, and influence like Washington and Jefferson and Franklin, why do they, initially get involved in the revolution, but why do they continue that when they have so much to lose?
Well, that is a great question. I do think that, I've mentioned some of the economic motives. I want to smuggle molasses. I want to take land from Indians or whatever. And they did have those economic motives, but there's an idea behind those economic motives. And that is that if I can maintain a certain amount of wealth, it gives me personal independence. And that when they talked about liberty, that's really what they were talking about. And they thought the British were threatening that. And, I think they've got a point about the precedent of taxation. If I let you tax me 1 penny and I don't have any representation in your legislature and I let you tax 1 penny, then you can come back the next year and go, well, this year we're going to make it $1 and then it's $1,000 a year after that. The power to tax is the power to destroy. So I think they were sincere about that. But I would also add an element to that for you're talking about the well-to-do types, the officers in particular, they craved honor more than they craved money or anything else. And this is a real distinction between the officers and the men, in that the men, maybe once in a while, a guy would, jump on a grenade. They even had grenades in those days. That's where grenadier comes from. So a man might get glory by jumping on a grenade, but in general, enlisted men got glory collectively. Oh yeah, the Virginia regiment did a great job. Whereas somebody like Washington, I'm really thinking of my fellow South Carolinians here, John Lawrence, they could get glory as individuals. And that's what got Lawrence killed. He went AWOL in order to go participate in the battle where he was killed. And it was really, if he hadn't been killed, it would have been court-martialed, because A, he wasn't supposed to be there, and B, he had reinforcements on the way, and he chose not to wait for them because he wanted that glory. So I think there's a very interesting combination of motives among these officers, from very noble motives of seeking their liberty and loving their country, wanting that liberty for others, right down to, and this is I understand that honor is a noble motive as well. It causes soldiers in all times, to make amazing sacrifices, whether it's merely the sacrifice like some of my friends who are soldiers here in Columbia. We have the biggest basic training base in the country here, Fort Jackson. They make sacrifices, not seeing their kids for a year. And when they're 2 years old, it's a different child you come home to. Or they make sacrifices at the opposite extreme of jumping on a grenade and giving their life. Anyway, it's a combination of personal motives that can range from honor and fame and the desire for fame to mundane motives like the economic ones. But I think I'm outside my expertise here, but I'll just opine to you and get your opinion that in a conflict like this, the crasser motives sort of fall away in about year 3 or 4. And if you don't have the higher motives, then you fall away too.
You don't often think of a glass ceiling for men like Washington or Franklin or Jefferson. I've always thought that in their mind, like if you take Washington, he worked really hard to be in that class. That Washington family wasn't in the same level as some of the other Virginia families, for example, but no matter how hard he worked, how much money he acquired, he was never going to get to that level where he would be considered equal with, say, British, not even just nobility, but aristocracy. I wonder if that glass ceiling played any role in it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think the most fun counterfactual where you imagine things going differently, and the most exciting counterfactual that I can think of from the Revolution is, suppose the British Navy, where he tried first, or the British Army, had given Washington the commission as an officer that he had so long desired. Now, there were British officers who left the British Army to come fight on the American side, like his number two, Charles Lee, and Horatio Gates, who was known as the hero of the Battle of Saratoga, the British surrender there in 1777. So it's possible under this made-up scenario where Washington gets a commission as a colonel in the British Army in, say, 1756, right after Braddock's defeat that I mentioned outside Pittsburgh. It's possible that he becomes a colonel of the British Army and does lots of glorious things in the French and Indian War, and then also still leaves because he, like Robert E. Lee, 100 years later, he would have chosen his loyalty to his colony over the crown. But he might have stayed with the crown, is my point. And so, yes, he was extremely resentful. I certainly wouldn't say anything as low about him that, oh, this was just sour grapes that he's taking on the British Empire, because they wouldn't give him a job. But it is true that he really wanted that commission in the British Army, and it was part of the British prejudice against the colonies. As you know, in many cultures, the army is the most conservative institution there, and they just were not, sometimes they're the opposite of that. They were the first institution in my town to integrate in 1948.
Right, yeah.
But in this case, it was the opposite of that. They were so conservative, and that meant that, anybody in Britain can buy themselves a commission, at least on the lower levels in the British Army. But, oh, no, certainly we're not going to take a colonist as an officer.
Well, you mentioned the hero of Saratoga, Horatio Gates. It's interesting. I guess we'll leave Camden for a different day.
We can't, except also you made me say, since I've lived 20 miles from there, that I think Gates gets a little bit of a raw deal on Camden.
Okay.
At least in the initial moments of that battle. He clearly ran from the battle.
That's right, yes.
No way to justify that for an enlisted man, much less an officer like him. But he wasn't being overly aggressive. He was just trying to get to the side of a river, which is a great place to defend from, as I'm sure you experienced in the Army. And he wasn't actually sending his militia against the other side, but he thought he saw this great opportunity. And I did not serve in the military, but I understand that a missed opportunity, if you have an opportunity and you don't take it, it's like having 4 aces and not betting on it. You got to go for it. He thought he saw a weakness on the British side, but it was where his militia was, and so he had no choice but to send his militia forward. So, sometimes commanders just suffer from bad luck.
Oh, yeah.
He had good luck at Saratoga and bad luck at Camden.
So we come to the conclusion of the war, and there were several people that were integral, not just men like Washington and Franklin and Jefferson, but just the average person and the poor. I'm wondering, after the war, because of that sacrifice and service, later on you're going to have Jacksonian democracy, but are there antecedents in the American Revolution because of that service where the poor wanted a greater participation and a larger voice in the politics?
Yes, and I want to talk about the end of the war, but actually I think the poor wanting and asserting their demand for a greater say in things, the high point of that is 1776. Thomas Paine published Common Sense, his pamphlet, in January of 1786. And not only does it say we should declare independence, and I think it encouraged people to do that, along with their anger at the British for allying with the slaves and all the other things we've talked about. But Thomas Paine, in addition to that, said, A, we should declare independence, and B, we should establish republican governments. And of course, I mean small r republics with no monarchy and with no House of Lords or aristocracy or of any of that. And that made independence much more attractive for a lot of common people because they were seeing in independence, not only will we cast off the British yoke, but we're going to have more power with respect to the elites. That is, that we're going to get out from under the elite rule. There were all these rebellions in colonial America. We talked a little bit about slave revolts, but North Carolina, there was a rebellion called the Regulator Rebellion. against those lawyers and really corrupt government officials, which we all know something about those, and a tenants' revolt. Remember the guy saying the rent is too damn high in New York City? Well, they were saying that up the Hudson Valley in 1760. People were killed in that little war of tenants versus landlord in the 1760s. My point is there's all these conflicts going on before the war of Americans versus Americans, elites versus common people. And a lot of common people said after Common Sense came out that independence is going to give us a Republican government. That is a government where everybody's equal in their power. And we're excited about that. And one group I really have to single out, which might surprise some of the people listening, and that was evangelical Christians. There was a religious revolt in the mid 1700s here that we call the Great Awakening. It's where the Baptists broke out of Rhode Island, would be one way to put it. And as you know, they're the biggest denomination in my region of the country still today. And they took off during the Great Awakening. Methodists, the Presbyterians split into a more evangelical side and the more mainstream side. So did the Puritans, who were called the Congregationalists by then. And so you have all these people who are religious dissenters. And I'm sad to say, on behalf of people that we like in Virginia and in Connecticut in particular, the old line, Episcopalians and Congregationalists, suppressed the evangelicals and threw them in jail just for being a Baptist minister. And there are all these stories of these ministers preaching through the jail bars to their flock who would gather outside the jail. But there was no religious freedom in most of the colonies. And so here's what happens when we get to the spring of 1776 and the elite is inching towards independence. Groups like, I can think in particular of the Prince William County up near what's now Washington, D.C., Prince William County, Virginia, Baptists say to the elites, oh, you want to go to war against the British and declare independence? We're fine with that on one condition. And that one condition is you got to guarantee us religious liberty. So, when Jefferson wrote his own epitaph for his tombstone, he mentioned three things: writing the Declaration of Independence, founding a non-preacher University of Virginia, unlike the old William and Mary where he'd gone. He wanted a school where the teachers weren't preachers. But the third thing he mentioned was the Statute of Virginia for religious freedom, adopted 4 years before the First Amendment, and which only protects us against Congress and infringement on our religious liberty. Virginia had this much stronger religious freedom law, and Jefferson rightly gets credit for writing it, but it never would have been adopted if it hadn't been for the evangelical Christians in Virginia who were saying we want religious liberty, not just for ourselves, but for everybody. And they were in a position to demand it because you can't fight an army with just officers. You need enlisted men. And they were offering their services, but you could also sort of call that blackmail, saying we're happy to serve, but you got to serve us too by giving us religious freedom and by more Republican governments. And they got much more Republican governments, at least for a while, during and after the Revolution.
Well, soldiers get benefits today, like the GI Bill and so forth.
Absolutely.
So that's just one of those benefits that those soldiers got back. Just have time for a few more questions, and let's move a little bit past the war. In your book, you also mentioned the Constitution. What do most Americans get wrong about the Constitution? It's not just simply a document about establishing political structures and protecting freedoms.
Correct. My short answer to what do people get wrong about the Constitution is everything. When I talk about the Constitution in class, I start with little video clips from John Boehner, when he was the Republican Speaker of the House of Representatives at the time, and Hillary Clinton, who I think was Secretary of the State at the time, both of them saying, we've got to fight for our Constitution and that crucial principle laid down in the Constitution that all men are created equal, which of course is not in the Constitution, it's in the
Declaration
of Independence. And so that's the first thing people get wrong about that. They confuse the 1776 document that destroyed an empire with the 1787 document, the Constitution, that created an empire, because what came out of 1776 was 13 countries. When we say United States today, we think of, oh yeah, we focus on the united part, but state, and this is still true in French and Spanish, state, estado, état, means country. we were the United Countries would be a better modern translation of what we originally were during the Revolution and under the Articles of Confederation. It was an alliance among these 13 countries or nations until 1787, when it had been called the Federal Convention, but that we today we call it the Constitutional Convention, because they made this incredibly radical proposal to take these 13 countries and for major purposes fuse them into one. And it was such a radical idea because, hey, we just broke up a British Empire back in 1776. Why are we going to make ourselves into a new empire now? The historians, there's no polls, but historians estimate that about half the people opposed the Constitution, and it was kind of rammed through in a bunch of the states. But the people pushing it pushed it because they believed, A, we need a more united front if the British ever come back, which of course they did in 1812. We need a powerful army to deal with the Indians. And in fact, here's an amazing stat. In the first 6 years of its operation, the United States government, under the Constitution, finally got the power to adopt taxes. 5 out of every $6 they spent was spent fighting Native Americans. So that was a reason to unify, to have that tax and have that army. But that army could also deal with putting down rebellions, which they did. My book ends with the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794 taking place in that same section of Western Pennsylvania where I opened the book. So you needed an army for that. But I'd say the single biggest motive, and my frenemy, Gordon Wood, who I really admire, and we've been friends, but we fight over things like the role of African Americans in the war. And that's why I call us frenemies, but we are friends on this point. The number one reason that the men who wrote the Constitution did so was that they thought the 13 states had become too democratic. Pennsylvania, for instance, they didn't have a Senate, they didn't have a governor. So all you had to do was get a bill through the lower house of the legislature, and then it becomes a law. There's no checks and balances on them. And that lower house of the legislature, they're elected every single year. And so they are really like the puppets of the people, because if they vote wrong, then they get voted out. And if you are really a strong believer in democracy, you think that's great. But the men who wrote the Constitution thought that was terrible, that was, to use a phrase that Alexander Hamilton used at the Constitutional Convention, an excess of democracy. And Elbridge Gerry, he was on the other side of the convention. He ended up opposing the Constitution because it didn't have a Bill of Rights. But he agreed. He used that same phrase, excess of democracy. And so to answer your question, I think the biggest myth that people have about the Constitution was that it was sort of in the same spirit as the Declaration of Independence, but it wasn't. It was an effort to rein in what they considered the excess of democracy. And you do that by not electing representatives every single year, but senators are elected every 6 years, and they're not elected by the people until 1913. They were elected under the Constitution by the state legislatures. So they're acting as insulation, just like you're glad you have insulation with a foot of snow on the ground.
That's right.
So you don't freeze. The Senate and the Electoral College, which of course we still have, the long terms, the life terms of Supreme Court justices, those are all insulation between the leaders and the people, because the men who wrote the Constitution thought that we'd gone too far in the other direction, where the people are the puppet masters and their public servants are literally servants just doing whatever the people tell them to do. And I think it's a fun debate, and basically depends on the issue, which side I'm on, because I think you can make a case for too much democracy, you can make a case for not enough democracy.
The last question I have for you, how do we best celebrate the accomplishments of the revolutionary period, or just the United States in general, the things that we've done, but still acknowledge some of those real negatives to our past, the darkness of our past? How do we celebrate both of those? How can we celebrate George Washington and then realize that he owned slavery? And how can we celebrate the revolution when we know that women were treated poorly and the black soldiers who fought were double-crossed later and the Native Americans were treated poorly? How do you square those two?
Well, the first thing that I would say is I am more into celebrating the principles enunciated by someone like Thomas Jefferson than I am into celebrating Jefferson himself. Jefferson was human. I won't say he was as human as I am, because he also did all these inventions and so forth, but he was a human being just like you and me, who had weaknesses and strengths. And so there's a lot of statues coming down. We talked before we went on the air about some George Rogers Clark statues coming down. The one statue that nobody wants to take, or maybe some of the anti-immigration people, but hardly anybody wants to take down, is the Statue of Liberty. Because the Statue of Liberty is not celebrating some lady, because, sorry, ladies listening, every lady, like every man, maybe not quite as much as every man, but every lady has her weaknesses. And the Statue of Liberty represents a principle. And so I think if you want to not have your head explode as you think about the contradictions that you just mentioned, is to exhibit your loyalty and to feel your love for the principles, because the principles like freedom of speech. I'm involved in a big battle for freedom of speech here in South Carolina, where there's a bill to ban this book, the 1619 Project that I mentioned. That book has problems, just like my book has problems and your book has problems, but it's a book. This is America. We have freedom of speech. So that's a beautiful principle, freedom of speech, that not everybody has, and people neglect it and sometimes try to step on it. And all men are created equal, revised by Elizabeth Cady Stanton in 1848 to all men and women are created equal, a magnificent principle. That's what we can feel strength about. I would not commit myself too much to individuals, because every individual has feet of clay. I would also say that you just have to be able to handle contradictions. And everybody, you've got a best friend and maybe a spouse, and as I do, but we know from our best friends and our worst enemies that our worst enemies have positive qualities, and the people we admire most have negative qualities. Why can't we do that with the founders and say, Thomas Jefferson is a man who hated slavery, denounced slavery all the time. He knew how terrible it was, and yet he continued to own 600 people. Or over the course of his life, he owned 600 people. That's a contradiction. But you and I are contradictory too. People are contradictory. Walt Whitman said, you say I contradict myself? Well, then I contradict myself. And I think it's something that Jefferson or anybody in American history could say as well.
Thank you, Dr. Holton. I really appreciate it. The book is really good, and it offers some different perspectives to think about, and it is very true. Liberty is indeed sweet. So thanks for your time today.
Well, I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
I would like to thank my guest once again, decorated professor and award-winning author, Dr. Woody Holton. And if you would like to get his new book, Liberty is Sweet, an integrated history of the American Revolution, simply click on the link in the description below. Of the book, Pulitzer Prize winning author Gordon S. Wood says, a spirited account of the revolution that brings everybody and everything into the story. Our featured brew was Sweet Liberty Imperial Stout from the brewery of Placentia, California. If you liked our talk today, please share this episode with a friend. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the podcast. If you're wanting more information on books and authors, like the History A Go-Go Facebook page, where you can leave comments and suggestions. The music was provided by the talented North Carolina band Bones Fork, and information on their new album, Beautiful Circle, is in the description below as well. Finally, to the growing list of listeners and supporters from more than 80 countries, whether you are from Austin, Texas, or Hannibal, Missouri, or from Dublin, Ireland, or Jerusalem, I have to say thank you. There are many more great episodes on the way, so join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.
Dan Scott, barely a week ago I heard you rail for 2 hours about independence.
And?
Mr. Hardwick, how many times have I heard you speak of freedom at my father's table? Half the men in this church, including you, Father, and you, Reverend, are as ardent patriots as I. Will you now, when you are needed most, stop at only words? Is that the sort of men you are? I ask only that you act upon the beliefs of which you have so strongly spoken, and in which you so strongly believe.